The sky above the alien stronghold was a strange mix of deep purple and burning orange as the human ship descended quietly through the clouds, its engines humming with a low, steady sound. David stood at the edge of the landing ramp, his sharp eyes fixed on the towering gates ahead. He had come alone, or at least that was what the aliens would think. His expression was calm, almost unreadable, but his mind was already measuring every possible outcome. He knew what was at stake, and he knew what would happen if the aliens refused to listen to him. The fortress loomed like a giant shadow carved from dark stone, and shimmering steel guards lined the walls, their weapons glowing with a deadly light. They were tall and cold, their armor reflecting the last rays of the sun, as if to intimidate whoever dared approach them. David walked forward without hesitation, his boots crunching against the rough ground. The alien guards stepped aside just enough to let him through, but their eyes followed him with open hatred. Inside the main hall, the air was heavy with heat and the scent of metal. Fires burned in tall braziers, casting flickering light across the faces of alien leaders seated on their thrones at the far end of the chamber. The leader was a massive creature with ridged skin and piercing yellow eyes. He leaned forward, resting his clawed hands on the armrests as David stepped into the center of the room. The princess was not there, but David already knew she was being kept deep within the fortress, surrounded by guards and locked behind doors of reinforced alloy. David's voice cut through the hall like a blade. He told the aliens that they had something that did not belong to them, that they were holding a royal figure against her will, and that this act would bring consequences they could not begin to imagine. His tone was calm, but there was a sharp edge to his words that made even the soldiers shift uncomfortably. He ordered them to release the princess immediately, to return her safely and unharmed. The alien leader leaned back and gave a slow, rasping laugh. The sound echoed off the walls like the hiss of a predator. He said the princess was now a bargaining tool, and that humans had no power here. He mocked David, asking if he truly believed he could intimidate them alone in their territory, surrounded by dozens of soldiers. David simply stared at the leader and repeated his warning one last time. He told them that if they did not release her, they would regret it. The hall erupted in cruel laughter. The aliens found the humans' calm threats amusing. They believed humans were weak, desperate, and too cautious to act against such a powerful force. They saw David as a lone man, foolish enough to think he could change their decision. David, however, did not argue further. He let their laughter fade and gave the leader a final steady look, as if silently promising that their arrogance would cost them dearly. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the chamber, his steps measured and quiet, but his mind already racing through the plan he had prepared for the moment. They ignored him as the great doors closed behind him. The alien leader gestured for his guards to tighten the security around the princess's cell. He dismissed the humans' threats as empty, believing there was nothing one man could do against their army. But far above the fortress, hidden in the dark sky, a series of faint signals began to pulse across the human network. David had not come alone, and the aliens would soon learn just how costly their defiance would be. David stepped away from the alien stronghold with the same steady pace he had shown when he entered. Though his expression was calm, his thoughts were focused and sharp as a blade. He knew the alien leaders would not listen to reason. They were far too arrogant and certain of their own power. But he had expected this outcome, and he had prepared for it long before he set foot on their soil. The wind carried the distant laughter of the aliens from inside the fortress, a cruel reminder of how little they respected his words. But David did not let it shake him. Instead, he tapped the communicator hidden in the sleeve of his jacket, sending a silent coded message to the strike team waiting far from the fortress walls. High in orbit above the planet, several human ships floated in the darkness, their engines running silently as they awaited David's signal. Inside each ship, teams of soldiers and operators sat ready, their weapons locked and their eyes watching the mission feed. One of them, a skilled technician named Mark, received the signal and immediately began initiating the first phase of their plan. He informed the others that David had confirmed the aliens' refusal and that the rescue operation would proceed exactly as planned. No one on the team questioned the decision, for they all trusted David's judgment completely. Back inside the fortress, the alien leader stood tall in the center of the grand hall, surrounded by his generals. He was confident and dismissive, waving his claws as he issued orders to double the security around the captured princess and to increase patrols along the outer walls. He spoke with pride about how the humans would now have no choice but to negotiate on the aliens' terms, and how their faction would gain unmatched leverage across the galaxy. If they held the princess long enough, none of his generals dared challenge him. Though a few shared uneasy glances, they had seen the look in David's eyes, and some wondered if perhaps there was truth behind his warning. Deep below the hall, in the cold metal corridors of the prison, the princess sat in her cell. She was young and graceful, but her eyes carried the quiet strength of someone who understood the weight of her situation. She had heard the voices of the alien guards outside her door mocking the human who had dared to demand her freedom. She closed her eyes for a moment and tried to believe that someone would come for her, though part of her feared she had been abandoned to the enemy's cruel designs. David, meanwhile, had moved to a ridge overlooking the alien stronghold. He crouched low, scanning the fortress with a pair of advanced optical lenses that mapped out every guard position, every turret, and every possible point of entry. He murmured updates into his communicator as he marked targets one by one. It was not anger that drove him, but a cold clarity. He had given the aliens every chance to avoid what was coming, yet they had chosen to ignore him, and now he would act without hesitation. As night fell over the fortress, a subtle tremor passed through the ground, unnoticed by the guards. The human strike team had begun their infiltration, moving through the tunnels they had prepared over the past few days of covert reconnaissance. Their equipment was designed to jam alien sensors and silence any alarms before long. Small sabotage devices were planted near the main power conduits, ready to disable the entire facility with a single commanding the alien command chamber. The leader received another message from David. This time his voice came through with calm precision. He reminded them that they still had one final chance to release the princess unharmed, and to avoid the consequences that would soon arrive. The alien leader growled in irritation and cut off the transmission, refusing even to acknowledge the threat. He told his generals that humans loved to talk and that David would do nothing for fear of starting a war. But the generals were less certain. They could feel the shift in the air, a growing sense of tension that crept into the room like a silent shadow. The princess heard the faint hum of the fortress power generators flickering for a brief moment before stabilizing again. She lifted her head, listening closely as distant footsteps echoed in the halls outside her cell. The guards seemed restless, as if they too felt something was about to happen. She moved closer to the door, straining to hear anything beyond the thick metal, but all she could make out was the low growl of alien voices arguing far above an orbit mark confirmed that all sabotage devices were in position and awaiting David's command. He reported that the infiltration team had successfully evaded detection, and that the fortress power grid was vulnerable. One single signal would plunge the entire stronghold into darkness and chaos. David heard the update and gave a simple order to hold until his mark. He wanted the aliens to know without any doubt that the moment they ignored him, they had sealed their own fate. The alien leader meanwhile celebrated his apparent victory, believing that the human had fled and that their control over the princess was secure. He spoke of demanding concessions from human leaders and using the princess as a tool to gain resources and territory. He failed to see the shadows gathering outside his walls, or the invisible network of humans already inside his fortress. As the second night on the planet began, the fortress burned with bright lights and restless energy, but the darkness outside was alive with unseen movement. David crouched Once more on the ridge, his hand resting on the small trigger device that would begin the retaliation. His eyes were locked on the fortress as he whispered quietly to himself that this was the last warning. The aliens would ever receive. The fortress stood silent against the night, its towers glowing faintly in the darkness, as if daring anyone to challenge its strength. But David watched from the ridge with unblinking eyes, his finger hovering over the small trigger in his hand. He could hear the faint voices of the alien guards, carried by the wind, their laughter cutting through the cold air. They believed they were untouchable and safe within the thick walls of their stronghold, yet David knew the time for their arrogance was over. He pressed the trigger, and a sharp pulse of energy shot through the ground, almost imperceptible at first, until one by one the glowing lights of the fortress flickered and went out. The entire stronghold was swallowed by sudden darkness. Confused shouts erupted from the walls as the aliens scrambled to understand what had happened. Their sensors failed, their automated turrets powered down, and the comforting hum of the energy shields faded into silence. For the first time, the aliens realized something was very wrong. Deep inside the fortress, the princess felt the sudden darkness and held her breath. The cold air of the cell thick with tension. She could hear the guards outside moving quickly, their boots striking the floor as they called for orders. Their voices carried an edge of fear they had not shown before. She rose slowly and moved closer to the door, knowing that something had changed, though she could not yet see what. The human strike team moved like shadows, slipping through the outer defenses while the aliens were distracted. They worked in pairs, using silenced weapons and short bursts of energy blades to eliminate guards without a sound. Every step was measured and precise, their training showing in the way they cleared corridors and secured rooms without leaving a trace. One of the soldiers whispered updates to David through the comlink, telling him that the path to the detention level was nearly clear. The alien leader stormed through the command chamber, his claws tearing through a console as he demanded answers from his subordinates. He shouted at the technicians to restore power and to seal every exit, but the technicians only shook their heads. Their equipment was useless without the generators. David's sabotage had been thorough. The leader's anger turned to fear as he realized the human had not been bluffing. He ordered more guards to the princess's cell, believing that she was the target. But even as he gave the command, the human team was already approaching the lower levels. David left the ridge and began moving toward the fortress himself, his steps quick and silent. He carried a compact rifle across his back, but his focus was on reaching the princess before the aliens could harm her. He entered through a breach cut by his team and descended into the narrow corridors that led to the prison levels. The halls were filled with smoke from small-timed explosives that had disabled cameras and sensors, and the bodies of stunned alien guards lay scattered where the humans had passed. The princess could hear distant explosions, now faint but growing louder with each passing moment. She pressed her hands against the cold metal door of her cell and whispered a silent plea for rescue. Her heart raced as heavy footsteps approached from the corridor outside. A group of alien guards stopped in front of the door, arguing in harsh voices about whether to move her or wait for reinforcements. Before they could decide, a small explosive charge rolled silently across the floor and detonated with a bright flash. The door to the cell burst inward as David and two members of the strike team rushed in, their weapons raised. The aliens tried to react but were cut down with swift, precise shots, leaving the princess staring in shock at the sight of the human she had only heard about. David stepped forward and extended his hand, his expression calm, but his voice firm as he told her they were leaving now. She hesitated for only a moment before taking his hand. Team moved quickly, leading her through the winding corridors toward the extraction point. But the alien leader had already regrouped and was throwing every remaining soldier into the hunt for them. Alarms began to blare as emergency power came online, bathing the halls in red light. The sound of heavy boots echoed through the stronghold as alien reinforcements closed in on every side. David signaled his team to split up and create diversions, while he stayed with the princess. He knew the aliens would expect him to take the most direct route, so instead he guided her through maintenance tunnels and ventilation shafts that twisted like veins through the walls. The princess followed him closely, her fear slowly giving way to a fragile hope as she realized the humans were not leaving her behind above the planet. The human ships received David's signal confirming the princess was in their custody. They prepared to move into the atmosphere, their engines warming, as they armed the orbital weapons that would be the final phase of the plan. Mark contacted David, telling him the extraction window was closing, and they had to reach the surface soon. David acknowledged the message, but his focus was on navigating the last maze of tunnels that would lead them out. Alien leader finally caught sight of the human on the security feed, his anger boiling as he realized how close they were to escaping. He ordered his soldiers to seal the lower exits and bring every available unit to the southern quadrant. He swore that the human and the princess would not leave his fortress alive. David could hear the alien soldiers closing in from behind, their guttural voices growing louder as they advanced. He moved faster, guiding the princess through the final corridor. Before the exit hatch came into view, he reached for the control panel, but before he could open it, a massive explosion shook the tunnel, collapsing the passage behind them and cutting off the aliens who had been chasing them. For a moment, there was only silence. David looked at the princess and nodded before opening the hatch to the night air. The cold wind struck their faces as they stepped outside, but they were not safe yet. The alien leader had deployed heavy forces around the perimeter, and their silhouettes could already be seen moving through the darkness. David knew the fight was far from over, but he tightened his grip on his weapon and prepared for what was coming next. The cold night air carried the sharp scent of smoke as David guided the princess out of the tunnel, the sound of distant explosions echoing through the valley around the alien stronghold. Their breaths formed pale clouds in the freezing wind, and though the stars glittered above them like scattered diamonds, there was no beauty in the night, only danger and the weight of survival. The princess kept close to David, her steps quick and quiet as they moved toward the extraction point, but they both knew the aliens would not let them go so easily. They had barely crossed the first clearing when blinding searchlights swept across the ground, followed by the echo of guttural voices barking orders from the darkness. Dozens of alien soldiers emerged from behind the rocks, their glowing weapons raised as they surrounded the humans. David pushed the princess behind him, raising his rifle with steady hands as the first bolts of energy tore through the air. He fired in quick, precise bursts, each shot cutting through the advancing soldiers while the princess stayed low behind the cover of a jagged boulder. Air crackled with heat as more enemy fire streaked past David's position, forcing him to retreat slowly toward a cluster of trees. He could hear the voice of the alien commander shouting from somewhere beyond the lights, ordering his troops to capture the princess alive and to bring the human down at any cost. David gritted his teeth and signaled the remaining members of his strike team through the comlink. Within moments, distant gunfire erupted from multiple directions as his soldiers opened fire on the enemy from hidden vantage points, turning the open battlefield into chaos. The princess watched in fear and awe as the humans fought with flawless coordination, each movement precise and deliberate. Despite being outnumbered, they struck with a ferocity that the aliens had not expected, taking advantage of every shadow and every distraction. David moved like a ghost through the smoke, his rifle never missing its mark, and when his ammunition ran low, he switched to a compact blade, striking down enemies in close combat with brutal efficiency. The alien commander finally stepped into view, towering over his soldiers, his armor glinting under the searchlights. He carried a massive blade crackling with energy, and his yellow eyes locked onto David with pure hatred. He roared a challenge and charged forward, scattering his own troops as he swung the blade with terrifying strength. David barely rolled aside in time, the ground splitting where the weapon struck. The princess gasped, but David was already on his feet, ready for the fight he had known would come. The two clashed in a storm of steel and energy, the alien commander using raw power to overwhelm his opponent, while David relied on speed and precision. Each strike sent sparks flying as their weapons collided, the sound echoing through the trees around them. The commander taunted David, calling him a weak human who had dared to challenge a force far greater than himself, but David ignored the words, focusing only on the openings in the alien's defense. He ducked low, avoiding a sweeping strike, and countered with a brutal slash that tore through the commander's armor, leaving a glowing wound across his chest. The commander roared in rage and swung wildly, forcing David back toward the cliff edge that overlooked the valley. The princess cried out, warning him of the danger, but David stood his ground, refusing to give the alien the satisfaction of seeing fear in his eyes. He feinted left, then suddenly rolled right, driving his blade deep into the commander's side. The panda's side. The alien staggered, but even wounded, he was a formidable opponent. He grabbed David by the throat, lifting him off the ground with a strength that made his vision blur in. That moment, the princess acted without thinking. She seized a fallen alien weapon and fired at the commander's arm, forcing him to release. David, who dropped to the ground gasping for air, recovered quickly, and with a final surge of strength, he drove his blade upward, piercing the alien commander's chest. The massive creature let out a strangled roar before collapsing onto the ground, the light fading from his eyes. The surrounding alien soldiers hesitated at the sight of their fallen leader, their morale breaking in an instant. David raised his weapon and ordered them to stand down, his voice cold and unwavering. Several dropped their arms and fled into the darkness, while others retreated slowly, unwilling to fight without their commander. David wasted no time signaling his team to regroup as they pushed through the remaining resistance and moved quickly toward the extraction point. The princess stayed close to David, still shaken by the battle, but grateful that he had not fallen. The humans fought their way through the last line of enemy forces with grim determination, reaching the open field, where the extraction ship was already descending, its engines roaring like thunder. Mark's voice came through the comlink, urging David to hurry as enemy reinforcements were closing in from the northern ridge. David guided the princess up the ramp of the ship while his soldiers covered their retreat, trading fire with the aliens who were determined to stop them. Ramps sealed shut as the ship lifted into the night sky, leaving the battlefield behind. The princess collapsed into a seat, her hands trembling as she tried to process the chaos she had just witnessed. David stood near the cockpit, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit, but he knew they were not safe yet. The alien forces would not simply give up. They would throw everything they had at the human ship before it could break. Through the atmosphere, Mark reported that enemy interceptors were already launching from the fortress, and they would be upon them in minutes. David tightened his grip on the railing as he prepared for the next stage of the fight. He looked at the princess and assured her that they would not let the aliens take her again, even if it meant sacrificing everything. The ship's engines roared as it climbed higher into the sky, the stars growing brighter above them while the threat of destruction closed in from below. The human ship soared higher and higher into the blackness of the night sky, its engines roaring with the effort of breaking through the planet's atmosphere, while enemy interceptors streaked behind it like furious shadows, determined to stop its escape. The princess sat silently in her seat, clutching the harness straps, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. But her eyes never left David, who stood near the cockpit, braced against the shaking of the ship. His face was calm, though his eyes were sharp and unyielding, as if every ounce of his focus was on making sure they survived. S' voice came through the comlink, strained but steady, as he announced that the enemy was closing in faster than expected. He explained that the alien fighters were better equipped for atmospheric combat, and that they might be caught before they could reach orbit. David listened without flinching and gave a single order to activate evasive maneuvers. The ship banked hard to the left, throwing everyone against their restraints as enemy fire tore through the air. Just behind them, explosions lit up the darkness around the ship as the alien fighters fired, relentlessly forcing the humans to weave and dive through the upper atmosphere. One blast struck the rear thrusters, sending the vessel spinning wildly for a few moments before the pilot regained control. The princess felt her stomach twist with fear, but David crouched beside her, gripping her shoulder and telling her in a steady voice that they would make it through. He had seen fear before many times, but this time, he would not allow it to take root in anyone on his team. At that moment, Mark reported that the human fleet was in position above the planet waiting for David's signal. David raised the communicator to his lips and sent the final code, a single phrase that told the fleet everything it needed to know. Within seconds, the night sky erupted with light as massive human warships decloaked in orbit, their weapons glowing like suns, ready to unleash destruction. The alien interceptors pursuing David's ship suddenly found themselves caught in a crossfire of laser fire and missile strikes, their formations breaking apart in chaos. The human ship pierced through the last layer of atmosphere and emerged into vastness of space, where the fleet had formed a protective wall around them. The alien commander's forces scrambled to regroup, but they were no match for the overwhelming firepower that now surrounded them. David ordered the fleet to hold nothing back, and a storm of destruction descended upon the alien stronghold below. The ground quaked as orbital strikes shattered the fortress, leveling the towers that had once stood as symbols of alien arrogance. The princess watched the devastation from the viewing port, her hands trembling as she understood the scale of the retaliation. She felt sorrow for the lives lost, but she also knew that the aliens had brought this upon themselves by ignoring David's warning. She turned to him and whispered her gratitude, her voice soft but filled with emotion. David nodded and assured her that humans protect those they call allies and that no threat would ever change that. The alien survivors sent desperate transmissions begging for mercy, but David's response was clear and unwavering. He told them that they had been given every chance to avoid this fate, and that the lesson they would carry from this day forward was to never underestimate humanity again. His words carried across the channels like a cold wind, leaving the aliens silent and defeated as they realized the cost of their defiance. Princess approached David and thanked him again, this time looking directly into his eyes. She admitted that she had doubted whether anyone could save her, but now she understood the lengths to which humans would go to protect their word. David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder and told her that she was safe now and that she would be returned to her people soon as the fleet prepared to depart the ruined planet. David stood near the observation deck, watching the last fires fade in the distance. He knew this mission would become another story told across the galaxy, a reminder that humanity, though small in number, could strike with unparalleled precision when pushed too far. He turned to the princess one final time and offered her a faint but genuine smile before saying the words that would echo in the minds of the defeated aliens for years to come. Next time, listen. Fleet engines ignited in unison, propelling the ships away from the battlefield and into the endless, starry void, leaving behind only silence and the memory of a warning that should never have been ignored. David stood tall as the human ships disappeared into hyperspace, his mission complete and the princess safe by his side. The galaxy would remember this day not as a simple rescue, but as a message written in fire and steel, that humanity would not be underestimated again. The end.